Hi guys, Todd back with another Magic Online video for you. We're fresh back from a long trip to London for Grand Prix London. Had a great time. I played Bant in the event as I've been playing over the last few weeks in various standard tournaments. And I ended up making top 16, but I had the same record as the guy in like 42nd place or something. So 12 and 3 went pretty far down. So basically, the general premise behind this deck, for those of you who haven't seen or played much standard recently, or for those who just aren't really familiar with the archetype because it's not a very highly played one. So Bant is, the strategy centered around heroic creatures. You target them with various spells to put a bunch of +1/+1 counters on it, and then you kind of sit behind it and play battleship magic. And that basically means that you want to try to ride this hero to victory, basically. And with the Glanaban Trailblazer, that is a literal thing because it is a centaur. But yeah, you just try to pump it up with a bunch of spells and use like God's Willing or I guess Valor Stance or a number of other ways to keep it alive as long as possible. Now, the way that Blue-White Heroic works is that usually Blue-White Heroic tries to play this weird game of Magic where they're not actually trying to play Magic with you. They're just kind of doing their own thing, and if you happen to play something that interacts with them, they're going to try their best to stop that. It's a lot like playing solitaire in a lot of ways, and I think that Blue-White Heroic is one of the things that gives Heroic in general a bad name. It's not really that fun to play with, it's not really that fun to play against, and that's one of the reasons why people don't really think that Heroic is a good deck in general. Now, myself and Tom Ross and a number of other people that we have talked to a lot about the archetype have really understood what it means when I say Bant Heroic. Now, the only real change to this version of the deck that makes it interactive and that gives it a lot of play and a lot of power, a lot of raw power, is Dromoka's Command. Now, if you notice, Dromoka's Command's abilities let you target multiple creatures with the same spell. That's pretty powerful with two hero creatures in play because it lets you usually put two counters on a guy and then put one counter on one guy and fight their creature. Now, Dromoka's Command is just an insanely powerful card. You've seen it across a number of decks. The Abzan aggro decks, Kibler, green, white. If you've seen Heroic before, you've probably seen it in a Bant Heroic strategy as well. But for the most part, Dromoka's Command gives you a way to really get out of a lot of sticky situations just because of the target player sacrifices an enchantment. When you're playing a format as deep as Standard, you're going to run into a lot of weird stuff. Sphinx's Tutelage, for example, is a really good one, winning Grand Prix, I want to say Los Angeles. I don't remember the name of the city. But, when decks like that just come out of nowhere, they catch people by surprise. And having a card like Dromoka's Command that is just inherently powerful in your deck, while also giving you outs to random stuff that the field might present, is really important for a deck like Heroic. Since a lot of our game plan is linear, we don't want to be colded by a single card or a single strategy. Dromoka's Command is the only green card in the deck. It is what gives it the green splash. There aren't really any other green cards I would want to play. I've looked at a ton of different options, and really, this is it. And a lot of people ask me, they're like, well, is it really worth it? Blue-White is really strong. It has like a bunch of Aqueous Forms and Ordeal of Heliod's to make sure that you don't die to like red decks and you can get under green decks pretty quickly. But I always tell them that, I don't really think that those decks can beat very specific things. And the one thing I like about Bant Heroic is that you actually get to interact with your opponent. You can kill their Jace Vryn's Prodigy on turn 2 or turn 3. You can kill their Soulfire Grandmaster before they start, buying back Stoke the Flames. You get to fight Mantis Riders that are beating you down in the air. There are a lot of spots where Dromoka's Command can just turn the game around completely in your favor for just 2 mana. Now, for those of you who play a lot with Dromoka's Command, you already get the gist of what I'm talking about. Dromoka's Command is just an insanely powerful card, and most of the time, all it does is put a +1/+1 counter on a guy and let you fight their creature. But the times where it does something besides that, that's where it really starts to stand out. The game where you prevent the damage from Anger of the Gods and save 3 creatures while also putting a counter on a guy. The game where you make them sacrifice their Corso Crucifix while fighting their Elvish Mystic and setting them completely far behind. And then there are other games where your guy is so big you can fight and kill a Tarka. You know, those are the spots where Dromoka's command really starts to just be overwhelmingly positive for a deck like Heroic, where, you know, the average power level of all the cards is usually pretty low. Heroic is a very synergistic deck, whereas most of the decks in Standard are based on raw power. You don't have a ton of cards that can win the game by themselves, but on the flip side of that, you get a lot of cards that work well together. And that's the kind of Magic that I like to play. I like a lot of my spells to complement the other ones. And yeah, it might be a little worse against something like Thoughtseize. You know, if my opponent comes really prepared for the matchup, he could have an advantage. And, you know, maybe there are a few cards that if my opponent draws multiples of them, I just can't really beat them. The standouts in mind are Ugin, Elspeth, these, you know, giant planeswalker type effects, or just big splashy spells that most creature decks can't really deal with unless they kill the opponent before a certain time. And I think that's okay. You know, we can look at the format every week and evaluate the type of things we need to beat, and we can alter our deck in a number of ways to really fight that. And if you paid attention to the coverage of Grand Prix London this past weekend, you would have noticed a gigantic rise in popularity of the Abzan Hangerback Walker deck that Brian Brown Doohan wrote about a week or two ago. That deck, for me, it came out of nowhere. You know, I expected Brian to play. He talked about it a lot. He thought it was really good, and I believed him. I was just so stuck on playing Heroic since I've been playing it for the last month that I didn't really take into consideration switching decks. And and there are merits to switching decks sometimes if something is presented to you as being unbelievably good, or if you're just not really comfortable with the current archetype that you're playing, you know, it's okay to switch every now and then. But when you got a good thing going, I don't really see a reason to hop from deck to deck every single week, and so I wasn't really planning on doing that. Now, when we get to Grand Prix London, we had a phenomenal time, by the way. The locals in London were just awesome people to hang out with. You know, I got to meet so many people at the meet and greet. We did a seminar about Standard and its progression over the last month and change. And overall, it was an overwhelmingly positive experience. But for me in the tournament, as for the matches themselves, I ended up playing against this Abzan Hangerback Walker deck 3 or 4 times, and it didn't really dawn on me what was going on or why this was happening until I talked to some of the pros from Europe who were playing the deck, and you know, they saw BBD's initial list, you know, the 2 weeks ago when he wrote about it the first time, and they said that they all had been testing it and working on it for, you know, in preparation for this Grand Prix, since, you know, they had an extra weekend of results from the previous Grand Prix that Michael Majors won with the tutelage deck, so they got to really see the metagame shape, and they had an extra week to really be outside the box and attack it from a different angle. And when almost all of the good players in the tournament brought this Abzan Hangerback Walker deck, I was scared. I went after I lost to it the first time. I just had to sit there for a minute and think to myself, like, I really hope there aren't that many people playing this deck. And it ended up being flooded in the top 8. It even got 9th place with Andrei Strasky, who actually beat me in round 14 in a win and almost in. If I had won my last round, I think my tiebreakers were good enough to get into top 8. But unfortunately, I want to say it's Andrei Strasky. I really don't want to mispronounce his name, but yeah. But he ended up getting 9th place, even though he won his last match, which is you know, a little sad. But at the same time, you know, there were already a ton of these Abzan aggro decks in top 8 with Hangerback Walker, and I just didn't think I could beat them. You know, it took me a while to really sit back and think about how I lost the games that I lost and why. And one of the main reasons, and by far the most glaring reason, was Hangerback Walker. The fact that I had them in my deck, but also the fact that they had them in theirs. Hangerback Walker for Heroic is incredibly problematic. We are planning on just building this one big creature most of the time and just kind of taking each turn one by one, trying to prevent their heroes' downfalls, their Abzan charms, trying to make sure that our guys are big enough to attack into theirs without threatening, death, and also just finding a way to really pierce their defenses so that we can end the game as quickly as possible, so they don't have a chance to draw into some of their more expensive, bigger spells. Hangerback Walker is just this colorless threat. The colorless part is really important because God's Willing gives your guy protection from a color. And usually God's Willing is saving your guy from a removal spell, but later in the game, a top deck God's Willing just kills your opponent most of the time. But when your opponent has Hangerback Walker, that's not the case. And when they have Hangerback Walker, not only to stall early, putting up a colorless blocker, but also when it dies, it creates a host of other colorless blockers. But then you also have the problem of a Den Protector returning them from their graveyard to their hand, and then you have so many other ways to just generate card advantage in general, and just as the game goes longer, these Abzan Hangerback decks just have a significant advantage over most decks in the format. And especially something like Heroic. We have a couple copies of Treasure Cruise, we have Ordeal of Thassa, we have ways to generate card advantage of our own, but that card advantage doesn't really mean a lot if we don't translate that into a victory against an opponent with a lot of board presence. And so I really decided to up the ante a little bit for this next week, or I guess this weekend. There's the Star City Games Modern Open in Charlotte, but if I don't do well in that, I'm going to be dropping and playing in the Standard Premier IQ on Sunday. So this is my testing for that, and also just my recap of my experiences this past weekend. But we're going to go over the rest of the deck real quick, and then we're going to get to some matches where we're going to play an 8-man tournament and maybe a 2-man, or maybe just 2 8-mans, depending on which round I lose. So first and foremost, the core of the deck. We have Favorite Hoplite, Laguna Bant Trailblazer as a 2 of. The reason it is a 2 of is that it obviously it's a heroic creature and heroic creature, whatever. It's a heroic creature that doesn't die to most traditional red removal spells, and it is one of the best things you can have in your opening hand against a very aggressive deck. Has high toughness, so it doesn't die to Bioblight, Lightning Strike, Wild Slash, etc., etc. Favorite Hoplite, however, is the 1-drop that you want 90% of the time or more, and the ability to prevent damage is pretty strong with him, since it helps you fight through things like Deathmist Raptor. It makes it so that stuff like Defiant Strike targeting your favorite Hoplite actually counters burn spells, which is great. And it's overall just like a phenomenal creature for this archetype. If this archetype were ever to break out of Standard into either Modern or Legacy, I think that Favorite Hoplite would be the reason why it did it. Very similar to like Glistener Elf in Infect. But the rest of the deck, we have 4 Seeker of the Way just because of how popular Mono Red is at the moment, both on Magic Online and in real life. Since it won the Pro Tour, it's just been flooding the metagame. But also, Seeker of the Way combined with Dromoka's Command allows for some really dirty interactions, being able to fight and kill a creature with it and gain a bunch of life, or just putting an extra counter here or there. The 4 Hero of Irosis, I see people cutting this sometimes for more copies of Battlewise Hoplite, and I want to just close the door on that right now. Battlewise Hoplite is the 5th hero of Iroas. There is no alternating between the two in Bant. In Bant, you do only have 4 Deal of Thassa as things that let hero reduce the casting cost. But with Heroic, you have so many spots where if you had a hero of Iroas in play, you would have an unbelievably good turn. You would be able to go Ordeal of Thassa, trigger it, draw 2 cards, and play Dromoka's Command, and hold up a God's Willing or something else. And without the Ordeal costing 1 mana, the entire turn would be impossible. And the turns where you get to do that are the turns where you end up turning the corner and winning the game. And that's one of the reasons why you always play 4 Hero of Iroas. I would never consider playing less than 4. And whenever anyone talks to me about wanting to cut one, I try to explain to them as best I can, is that the turns where Ordeal costs 1 are those are the games that you're almost always going to win. The thing that I want to emphasize the most here, as far as the change in the spell suite, is that we've moved to 3 copies of Valor Stance to help out against all these green decks popping up. Being able to either protect our creature from a hero's downfall or a murderous cut or ultimate price is good and all, and a Johnny's Presence does that pretty well as being a combat trick. But Valor Stance gives us a way to aggressively interact with our opponent, much like Dramoka's command. I've talked a lot about Valor Stance in the past in this archetype and the pros and cons of it, but for the most part, just being able to kill your opponent's creature pushes you closer to playing your Treasure Cruise. It makes sure that Whisperwood Elemental isn't able to overwhelm you. It makes sure things like Polukranos don't get gigantic and kill your entire board. And for the most part, it's just a versatile spell that a deck like Heroic really needs access to. Being able to have options at every point in every single turn, whether it's your turn or your opponent's turn, is huge for a deck like this, because we almost always have to leave up open mana on our opponent's turn to make sure that our creature survives. And lastly, we're going to be playing 2 copies of Monster Mentor in the main deck and a third one in the sideboard, and this is our direct response to Hanging-Back Walker. Hanging-Back Walker has been in this deck over the past few weeks, and the more I play with it in this strategy, the less I like it. There are times where it is very good, and there are times when it's not good at all. But all I know is that at Grand Prix London, playing with Hanging-Back Walker in a format full of my opponents having defensive Hanging-Back Walkers. Mine want to be more aggressive than theirs, but they just want theirs to be defensive. But in a format where they have Anafenza, Abzan Charm, and their own defensive Hanging-Back Walkers, I don't really want my own. I just want a way around them. And I think that Monastery Mentor is the best way to do that. I've toyed around with the idea of adding a third Treasure Cruise since I'm playing 2 copies of Mentor, but I don't really want to have too much Dirtle in game 1. I just want Treasure Cruise to be my backup plan in case my opponent has a really good draw with a bunch of Thoughtseizes and removal spells. It can help us draw into, more copies of Dramoka's Command and the like in the matchups where we really need to, but for the most part, Treasure Cruise is our backup, as well as Mentor in the first game. And if it just so happens that we draw both and we're able to start chaining off and comboing with it or whatever, then so be it. But it's not going to be the emphasis. The emphasis in game 1 is mostly on heroic creatures and making them as good as possible. After game 1, we get to the sideboard. We have a couple of different avenues that we can go down. My favorite being the turtle up behind a creature and just kind of turn into an honorary blue-white heroic deck, and only do this in extreme scenarios. We have 3 copies of Aqueous Form and a Lagana Band Trailblazer and 2 Ordeal of Heliod that we can bring in all of these against a deck that's not really trying to interact with you much and that's trying to completely cover up the ground. Now, most Hanging-Back Walker decks, this is going to be your game plan. You want to make sure that your Aqueous Form goes on your biggest guy, you want to make sure that that guy doesn't die, and you want to continually be able to attack with it, and so we usually bring in Ordeal of Heliod in those scenarios, even though life gain isn't necessarily good in a lot of those matchups, like the Green Devotion decks, like some other things. We're going to want this card that allows us to race our opponent, while keeping the pressure up, and Ordeal of Heliod is perfect for that. Now, we also have the 2 Ordeal of Heliod and the Lagana to come in against the mono-red decks, and it's been phenomenal there. I've even considered adding the 4th, but every time I add the 4th, I always draw like 3 of them, and I just don't want to play the deck anymore. So the rest of the sideboard, we do have the 3rd Mentor as well as the 3rd and 4th copies of Treasure Cruise, and that's going to allow us to win these attrition battles against decks that have a ton of removal and discard, and most Abzan decks in general. But the 3rd Mentor comes in against any deck that has Hanging-Back Walker, because you just have to be able to get around them, and if you don't, you're just going to lose. And you want to make sure you have a lot of both of those cards in your deck, so that even if they're able to kill the first one, you'll generally have time to find the second one, since you have so much scry with God's Willing and the Scry lands. You have a lot of removal with like Valor Stance and Dramoka's Command. You have a lot of card draw with Treasure Cruise and Ordeal of Thassa, and you just want to make sure that you have access to those cards in your deck later in the game, and you can actually find them so you can come back and get back into it. We have 2 copies of Disdainful Stroke and a Negate, and those can both come in different matchups, but both of them come in together against Control. You know, it's just the best at what it does, and there's not really a good substitute. I tried Stubborn Denial. I'm not impressed with it unless you're playing the strictly blue-white version of the deck, because you are playing 4 Hero Viros and 4 Battle-Wise Hoplite, so just a single Defiant Strike can give you a 4-power creature. Um, in this version, you know, we do have 2 Laganas, we have Mentor, we have more expensive things. We don't always have time to hold up for for a Stubborn Denial, and your opponent can turn it off pretty easily. And so, and for that reason alone, at the very least, I don't really like Stubborn Denial. I like it better in a deck that's a little lower to the ground. Blue-white Heroic is a lot lower to the ground, and I think Denial is much better there. But for us, we need these hard counters that can be good early or late, depending on the matchup. And then lastly, 2 Revoke Existence because of Hangerback Walker, and that's it. Well, I know it was a kind of a long deck tech. It was a little bit of a decompress from London. If you haven't seen the deck, I hope you learned a lot about it. Otherwise, if you have seen the deck, I hope that it was interesting to watch at the very least. Anyway, guys, we're going to go ahead and get to the games, and we'll be right back.